Hello, everybody. Welcome to the event today. My name's Owen Wells. I'm a senior lecturer here at GMD, and I'm very honoured to be able to welcome you all to the Peter Cannings Memorial Award event taking place today. First of all, I need to just go over a couple of house rules. So there's a little Q&A section here, and I just want to make everyone aware that there's a link to our virtual community code of conduct, as well as a little note that the views expressed here are those of the individual and do not represent the views of UAL. And if you'd like to have a look at the code of conduct, then please follow the links to do so. So hello everyone. Welcome to the Peter Cannings Memorial Award event, taking place as part of London College of Communication Graduate Showcase, offering a first look at the most exciting new names in design, media and screen. This year's Graduate Showcase, we will see students from all UAL colleges exhibiting their projects online under one virtual roof for the first time ever. So you can explore graduating students' work after this event by visiting graduateshowcase.arts.ac.uk/home. Let me just go over, a few more house rules. This event is being recorded and will be made public on UAL YouTube channels afterwards. By attending the live event, guests agree to their contributions being captured and used for this purpose. Please keep cameras off, although I'm not actually sure that for this event you're able to use your cameras anyway. I'm afraid that there's a Q&A box, but as this is really an events awarding, we're not going to be using it for this event. As I said, please note the community guidelines that they're in the chat bar. And after this event, you can share your thoughts on the showcase and this event across social media by using the hashtag LCC 2020. Okay, so as I said, my name's Owen Wells. I'm a senior lecturer on the graphic and media design course here at LCC, and it's been my honour to help organise the Peter Cannings Memorial event this year. Peter Cannings was a pioneering digital design lecturer here at the London College of Communication who very sadly passed away in 2012, and this award was set up in recognition of his achievements at the college and to honour his contribution to the design school. Over the past 4 years, this has been generously supported by the Dean of Design, Dr. Nikki Ryan, and the Head of London College of Communication and Pro Vice Chancellor of University of Arts London, Natalie Brett. The Peter Cannings Memorial Award recognises final year student work which carries on Peter's pioneering legacy of innovation in digital design and digital media. This year, we've sort of extended the award a little to incorporate the entire undergraduate design school. So we had submissions from 7 different courses across the school. Let me just kind of run down what's going to happen today as part of this event. I was going to pass you over to Graham Diprose, who's a lecturer, author, researcher, consultant, co-chair of EVA London, as well as one of the judges for the Lumen Prize. And he was here. He was going to be here representing the judging panel. He was a former lead tutor in photography at London College of Communication, and for many years he worked with Peter, and he's been the person I've been liaising with to organise the prize. But unfortunately, this being one of the first events, and we had a technical issue, and so unfortunately he can't join us, but he is watching. So I'll be sort of chairing the whole thing. Basically what's going to happen is we're going to have a little presentation from each of the 8, actually 9, one of them was collaborative, but 9 students who've been submitted, so shortlisted for the award. They are Mai Elemin from User Experience Design, Mark Hopini from Graphic and Media Design, David Valente from Information and Interface Design, Christina Lankova from Information and Interface Design, Miguel Despor from Graphic and Media Design, Rita Despor from Graphic and Media Design, Jennifer Nibbs from Design for Branded Spaces, and Marta Urbez and Monica Adamczyk from Graphic and Media Design. They're all going to present their projects, these sort of excellent projects that were submitted, and then we're going to announce the winner of the award. So the judging panel for this, we had a very, very eminent group of judges for this. who helped kind of judge the award. And they are Dr. Nick Lambert, who's chair of the Computer Arts Society and head of research at Ravensbourne, Carla Rapoport, founder and director of the Lumen Prize, and Aphra Shemza, who's one of the founders of the Art in Flux community of digital artists. It's an incredibly esteemed judging panel who helped whittle down what was a really exceptional group of shortlisted students to the eventual winner. Having said all that, I'd really like to invite our first shortlisted student, who I believe is Mai, to present her excellent project, which was shortlisted for the prize. So Mai, if you'd like to present your work.
Hello everyone, my name is May Element, and I will be presenting my final major project, #StandForStan. Next slide. #StandForSudan explores how political conversations can be conveyed through clothing in the context of the recent Sudanese revolution. This came after months of peaceful protests with thousands of women participating, unlike ever before, as society would have shunned them from doing so. This project showcases the invisible histories woven into the patterns and materials of the traditional dress called the tour, and poetically transforms the journey of the revolution. Next slide, please. This is my first outcome, a website as shown in the link below. In April of 2019, Ala Saleh gained worldwide media attention after a picture of her was taken in a protest. I wanted to recreate that moment initially, but I soon realized that she represented the young generation of Sudanese women. It was no longer fair to just represent her in my work, but to represent all Sudanese women. So I only showed the back of the 3D model. The design of the website shows a Sudanese woman protesting on a road, formed by the poem but coded to also stand with her, about to make her next step with her left foot, because in my culture, it is encouraged to enter a place with your right foot. So by showing the opposite, it shows that she's going against the unwritten rules of society. I used the color blue since people would change their profile picture on social media to this color, to stand in solidarity with Sudan and bring awareness to this uprising, and would chant poems on the street. I used the poem The Surrenderer for the website, because it was used in previous protests and was brought back to life by a female singer. Also being bilingual, I included a translation of the poem and included highlights of the revolution, where I also added my own pictures. At first, I was unsure of producing a political piece out of fear that would spark controversy. However, a quote made me realize that I should research more deeply into this matter. This was it. The work is political because it's politicized. Politicized bodies are featured in the work. I'm a political person because if I wasn't, that would affect my safety and well-being in a country. But that's not why I'm making my work. I'm making the work to leave a document of my experience and leave a document of the experience of people who are alike. Next slide, please. For my second outcome, I wanted to celebrate the tour. Unlike today, there was a time when designs of the material of the tour were named after social and political events that occurred. When women were silenced, they would design new fabrics that would signify a moment in history. Using a procedural method using nodes on Blender, I was able to create a realistic looking fabric. The video of the tour transitions through tours over a revolutionary period, beginning with Abu Gajaja as the one you see. Produced in the 1950s, this style of the white tour symbolized a working woman and granted them entry into public spaces. Now, if you click onto the bookmark, it's the second one, please. On the video. Sorry, there's a bookmark in the video. So if you click onto the middle one, transitioning to the independence, which displays the old Sudanese flag in 1956. And if you click onto the third bookmark on the video, please. It moves to the style Khartoum at night. that expressed the excitement women had to explore the capital city at night. Next slide, please. As a way of showcasing both pieces, I created a mock-up of how it could be displayed in an art gallery space and designed a brochure with the identifiable blue. Show how it would also change their brand to the colour like those that change their profile pictures on social. The brochure would explain about the exhibit and have the poem from the website written side by side in both English and Arabic, and display a close-up of the material created. I also wrote a proposal for the exhibit to be displayed in the new V&A building for Friday Lates. Friday Lates would be a good event to exhibit my work because it welcomes a different demographic and is inviting of new talents. The V&A has also collected African objects since its inception and has been active in representing African culture and of the diaspora, giving prominence to the projects related to Black identity in the UK. The exhibit projects the vision of Mr. Castley Hayford, the inaugural director of the new V&A, being built in East London. As he mentioned in an interview, we want to give you the tools to tell and retell your own stories through objects that move you, and to change the way that we think about ourselves and the world. Next slide. Thank you very much for listening.
Hello, I'm Marco Pini, and this is my project, Ripples from Palm Springs. Ripples from Palm Springs is an exploration of how thought patterns, and specifically academic writing, including dissertations and essays, are approached. I was influenced from my own dissertation this year, in which I drew influence from my interest in philosophy, and specifically in the philosophy of Deleuze. Deleuze and Guattari believe in the idea of systems and non-binary thinking. And I wanted to approach this to my own design practice and look at how design is fluid and not regimented. How much of regular academic exploration isn't exploration per se, as it focuses on linear and strict segmentary thought rather than exponential and nomadic journeys. But without too much jargon, it looks at how our brain is not ordered in the way that most academic systems usually try and approach it. This is because we are complex beings, and most of our thought is really just a process. They look at an idea of schizoanalysis, which celebrates sort of the chaotic nature of the mind and how thoughts and ideas are constantly in a state of becoming. Next slide, please. The way we think is complex and scattered. I'm interested in, with projects and dissertations especially, in the idea of intrigue itself, like what makes us want to pick certain topics, and why should we stick to one topic? Why we pick one topic? When we explore them, and whilst exploring them, we often get distracted and bring in other elements of our lives. So I wanted to take a bird's eye approach to the self-initiated project, exploring all of my interests as more of like an organism itself, because that's how thoughts and the brain usually operates, ideas. I was frustrated, as I think some people are, in the standard rigid form of process and outcome. I don't believe that there is ever fully an outcome in design, because our outcomes influence our next projects. An outcome means the end of a process, but really our design practice is a constant process. So the project was Ripples from Palm Springs, which I took my dissertation, which was looking at just my interest in tropical imagery and like flamingos, palm trees. This is just something I'm generally interested in, and I just wanted to explore why I was interested in that. But really, the subject itself of tropical stuff is really just a lens that I explore my own process of thinking about work. So I was looking at restlessness and non-linearity, and sort of a pro-broadness about our projects that we do. So I wanted to find a digital way to explore this. I looked at the closest thing to this, which is Wikipedia, and the game that I used to play in school, where you'd pick 2 words and try and get from one Wikipedia page to the other in as short as possible links as possible. In this way, this is a real great example of a Deleuzian process, and it shows how interconnected things are and how you can't really treat things as just one thing. They're not segmented. The next slide, please. Yeah. So I added many different entries, over 300, just over the course of doing this project. And I've still added entries to this day. It's a constant process. Next slide. Is this a video? No. Maybe the next one, I think. Next one. Yeah, this should be a video here. So the website acts as links between all these different imagery, and some of them are quite random. I was looking at like conspiracy theories. The coronavirus itself came into it quite a lot because that viruses act as sort of like a process of expansion, which was related a lot to the philosophies that I was looking at. And next slide, please. For this project, I was not keen on doing an outcome, but obviously that's part of what we have to do. So I wanted to find a way to make a physical version of a database. So I printed out all of the imagery and arranged it. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. So for the final outcome, I guess, to go alongside the database, I wanted to see how you can explore database in a physical way. So I thought the best outcome was something fluid, something flowing, and something in motion. Next slide, please. So I printed a database with the 300 entries onto a tapestry that I left in the wind. This meant I did not have to physically create the connections between the images. The wind would do this for me, creating natural grooves and folds, a key idea to Deleuzian theory. Next slide, please. The fold being the cause of an event. Next slide. Yes, thank you for listening.
Hello, I'm David, and this project is essentially a 6-month response to all the chaos and information that we've had over the past 6 months, where we can essentially trust no one because information has switched sides. We don't know what's true, we don't know what's not true. The WHO, the American CDC, the BBC, all of which and many more have at some point said something which has either turned out to be wrong or they've represented information in a wrong way. And so this project is an attempt to help people think more critically about all of the information that they receive rather than take a more leaned back approach to just accepting the guidance of authorities in a given space. Next slide. So focusing on news in particular, this is a typical layout of how we read the news, where it's like, here is the prescribed content from one individual or an organization or two or more individuals for some stories. And as you read pretty much any story, if you're doing it right, loads of questions will crop up as you're doing so. And there's no way in this space to get answers to those questions. The only other things in this space are adjacent stories, which are completely unrelated, but only presented there because they're chronologically similar. They're just the news from that day. Next story, next slide. Next slide. So this is a typical user flow for someone who like uses a smartphone, for instance, where they will open one app and they will flick through stories, and they will open another app and they will flick through social media posts. And then throughout their day, they will consume other forms of media. And throughout all of that, there will be connected dots that the user must do by themselves in their head, and they must remember the things that they saw previously in that day, and they can link things for a specific story that occurred that day. So I wanted to tackle that problem. Next slide. And so within all of that media, you will get the criticisms of something you saw previously. You'll get additional context that will change your perspective of something you read previously. And some of the questions which arose when you saw the original piece of media, you may get answered in these other forms. So I wanted to bring all of these elements together into one interface to make it a lot easier for people. Next slide. So this is the entrance point to the interface which I built. And so this makes an attempt to give an overview of what is happening in the world at a given point in time. So the news stories, for example, at the bottom are not just what you would typically get at the top of Google or Apple News. They are more representative of what is happening around the world. Next slide. So a user can take a URL of a story where they don't have that additional context, give it to my interface. And next slide, please. And this is what they're presented with. And this gives an overall view of different parties. So this is authorities and news organizations and individuals like you and me who have traction on specific posts about a given topic over time. And this can stretch back really far given on the topic. Next slide, please. So it starts here because it can show you where stories have peaked. So if you just, for example, Donald Trump in China, that some days there's nothing happening and some days everything is happening. And this highlights that in the structure of how it shows the bubbles. Next slide. And so you navigate this interface by scrolling left and right and using the slider at the top of the screen. And as you zoom in, you gradually build more detail with the dates, and you can see themes developing. So some stories will have like a single face, some stories about a given person. The majority of the bubbles will be that person's face, and sometimes you'll also see other people's faces, and you'll think, how is this person related? And this interface enables you to see how different stories are actually related. Next slide, please. And as you zoom in further, so this is the spike that you saw a couple of slides ago. You can then hover on the different tiles and really quickly get an overview of what's happening. And this hopefully leads to the user being more inquisitive and diving even deeper into a story much faster because of how I've structured it. Next slide. And one final thing that I added at the end was the ability to show videos. So, for example, with the Black Lives Matter protest, closer towards the peak of it a while ago, the media, the vast majority of it only showed one perspective of it. But through this interface, I was able to show, for example, on the left is officers taking a knee, in the middle is officers dancing, and on the right is what the media was showing you, which was the violent protest. And this interface gives you a much more rounded picture of what is actually happening in the world. Thanks for listening.
Hello. My final I'm Christina. My final project is called Journey to the Center of the Internet. Sorry. Okay. My final project is called Journey to the Center of the Internet, and it's a piece of research-driven art that allows the viewer to explore how metaphors shape the way we understand and interact with the internet. Next slide, please. The installation consists of a large blank or appearing blank television screen from which the viewer can hear a sort of city soundscape. And to interact with the installation, they put on a pair of polarizing glasses, which allows them to peep into a world that only exists normally within our imaginations. What they see on the screen is an animated illustration that depicts a variety of internet metaphors and invites them to reflect on what they think the inside of the internet looks like. And then alongside with this is a guidebook that presents the research behind the project. Next slide, please. The animation that is shown on the screen, I've got on the right there, but they would be viewing it only through the glasses. And the animation is a visual representation of several internet metaphors that we use to describe the internet, such as cloud, an information superhighway, cyberspace, global village, and the dark web. And the reason why I chose to explore this topic is because metaphors not only guide our imagination about a new invention, but they can influence the shape of what it becomes. And they don't exist in a vacuum because no metaphor can give a perfect representation. Each metaphor downplays or highlights certain aspects of a technology. And it's in this way that the choice of metaphors we use can reveal the intentions of both those who use them and those who design them. For example, as technology advances, judges and regulators often have to think about whether a new technology is sufficiently like an existing technology that we already have rules about. And that's where it can become quite political. Is the internet like a utility for the purposes of protecting net neutrality? Or is it like a hotel or a restaurant that needs to be accessible to people with disabilities? Next slide, please. These are the kind of questions I explored within my short essay. The essay is contained within the metaphor map, which on one side has an illustration that sort of points out different points on the animation. And then on the other side is a short essay that explores the invisibility of the internet, how each metaphor is used, its impact, what it hides, what it reveals, as well as the idea that it is all of our collective imaginations that create these ideas. And I chose to make it a map because it fits with the metaphor of going on a journey. It's quite large and clunky when you unfold it, so it draws on memories that are associated with traveling. And yeah, that's about it.
Hi everyone, my name is Miguel, and I'm going to be showing you a project called Design with Your Mind that I did as one of my major projects for graphic and media design. And this project allows users, it's a prototype that allows users to create things using a brain sensor. Next slide, please. So I started by wondering if there's a more natural way of interacting with computers than the current way we do things. So as an example, if you want to make a circle right now, you can go to Illustrator and use the circle tool and then drag a circle exactly the size you want it to be. Next slide. My hypothesis is what if computers know what you're thinking and you can just think of a circle and then the circle appears on the screen. Next slide. So of course, this technology doesn't exist right now, but what does exist is things like a Muse brain sensor, also known as a EEG. And this is a meditation device. It's meant for people to put it in their heads when they're meditating, and then it tracks how well you meditated. So it's really good to understand if you're very active or if you're focused on a specific task. So I use this device to get the data from your brain and then make things with it. Next slide. Here's a short video. It's less than a minute, but if I could just ask you to click again and you will play the video. So that's kind of like a product video explaining the idea. Unfortunately, we couldn't show sound on this presentation, but I think you get the idea of how it would work. That you put the brain sensor in your head, so you have to grab it, put it in your head. And next slide. Then the brain sensor connects with a phone. It's not the Muse app; it's another app, a third-party one that gets the data from the brain sensor and then streams it to an IP address. Next slide. And then my laptop gets that data, and I use processing to make a program, a prototype that gets that data and creates visual shapes, whether it's a circle getting smaller or bigger, or shapes being more blurred or less blurred, or a spiky shape getting more spiky or less spiky. Next slide, please. So if all of these things are connected properly, you should be able to wear this thing, and then the computer reflects your brain activity. Of course, ideally, if this was to be a final product that would work on Illustrator, for example, it would work you'd work just well with Illustrator. You wouldn't need to have all of these different steps. But for now, this is the way I've made it work. Next step. Next slide. So yeah, then I've called the project Design with Your Mind, and on the next couple of slides, you can skip slide, please. I've made a bunch of design assets that show how this product could be used in the design world, and it just explains how the project works. So on the next slide, these are some more cards made with assets from the brain sensor using a brain sensor. Next slide. Here are some more posters. Next slide. You could even have posters saying think, make, repeat, or next slide. Or a book, for example, all made with assets done with a brain sensor. And for example, if users are thinking of one pizza, you have a little circle. And then if on the next slide, you're thinking of many pizzas, there's a lot of circles on the book. Next slide. So yeah, that's as a conclusion for the project. I thought I'd show you 3 articles that just back up the fact that you might be using stuff like this in the future. So for example, Facebook is funding a brain experiment that allow people to create brain experiments to create a device that reads your mind. And also very recently in March 2020, BBC wrote an article that talks about some new discoveries of how scientists can decode what a person is saying just by looking at their brain activity. And even on a more scientific level, on the magazine Science, there's been articles written about patients with epilepsy getting brain implants that allows them to communicate better because they can understand what they're trying to say based on the implants. So this project is meant to be used by everyone who wants to make things, but I also think there's a great potential for people with disabilities to use tools like this to be able to express themselves better and communicate better. Next slide. That's it. Thanks for listening.
Hello everyone, my name is Rita and I'll be presenting a self-initiated project I did in the beginning of this academic year, and it's called the Sunset Project. Next slide. So this was actually inspired by my personal experience as a Portuguese person coming from Portugal, obviously, and going to London. And back home in Portugal, there's this kind of like ritual around contemplation of sunsets, being with friends. And I took this idea of contemplation and kind of wanted to translate that into a more graphic visualization of the contemplation. So this project kind of celebrates those colors of sunsets and paints them in unique gradients that people can generate from their own images. And it's called the Sunset Project. And the idea is to create this platform where people can come together, upload their images of sunsets and transform it into a unique gradient of their own. Next slide. So the result for this project were two things. So it was a grid of sunsets that showcases every gradient around the world, which is made out in a website page, and then also a generative tool that generates this kind of gradient from the images that people upload. Next slide. So this is actually an image that I took back in Portugal and of a sunset. And then next slide. Using the generative tool, it creates this gradient from which people can pick up the colors and just choose whatever color they think represent their memory better. Next slide. And this is just a video showing just how from that single image you can create so many beautiful gradients that can represent your memory or your photograph of that moment. And then people could download it and just save it or use it as artwork or desktop or whatever they felt was best. Next slide. This was then translated into a website that's called the Sunset Project, and it's a website again that celebrates the colors of sunsets and creates unique gradients for each image, and people could create their own. Or next slide, they could also see the collection of gradients from around the world. Next slide. You can have this gradient, this grid of gradients. Next slide. Or you can hover through every image and just see where they're from, what time, what day, what city. Next slide. There's a bunch of cities here. They're actually accurate, so actual images from sunsets around the world. Next slide. Or you can have it as bigger image. Next slide. Or even bigger. Next slide. There's also a page in this website where you can create your own or go back to the collection, which we just saw. Next slide. So to create your own, you can just upload the image. Next slide. And then it loads the image, which is the tool just generating the gradient or just basically picking up the code that I wrote, and then it creates the gradient. Next slide. So this is the kind of final product that you see, and then people can download it, and it's again just uses as their own artwork to remember that special moment or that special image. Next slide. And then yeah, and that's it. So the final image, the final website page is just a thank you for uploading, and it kind of encourages everyone to just bring their own images and see how it comes together from around the world, different gradients, different images, different people, different sunsets. Next slide. And that's it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, and this is my final major project, Dematerialize. Thank you. Sorry about the lack of sound in the video. Dematerialize is an immersive exhibition imagined at 180 The Strand, which investigates states of wakeful consciousness through a personal experience. Next slide. The exhibition offers viewers a chance to immerse themselves in their awakening consciousness. Next slide. Dematerialize transforms non-physical and intangible experiences into a physical, tangible journey by interrogating the awakening conscious state. This work brings the ethereal boundlessness of spiritual experiences into the physical world. Next slide. In this project, I use the terms wakefulness and awakening consciousness to describe a moment of clarity, which refers to a higher consciousness produced through meditative techniques. The project questions, how can experiential design encourage people to explore wakeful consciousness? And further, could this in turn enable a moment of wakeful consciousness? Next slide. The experience entails engaging in guided meditation, and afterwards the viewer is asked a series of questions based on their experience during the session. The response to these questions then determines their ensuing personal immersive experience. Next slide. This is a plan of the exhibition journey. At step 1, you remove your shoes and you enter the experience, where you tread barefoot onto the sand into step 2, where there's a waiting space to learn about the experience. Then you make your way to step 3, following a guided light through a foggy corridor, and enter stage 4, which is the meditation space. And next slide. Just talk through this now. So in the meditation space, viewers engage in a 10-minute guided meditation called A Meditation for Inner Peace. After meditating, the viewer then answers questions on a tablet inside their meditation pod based on this meditation session. The design of the experience incorporates the concept of meditating on a pebble through both a pebble cushion, sand, and water projections. Next slide. The questions in the pod asks the viewer how the space in their mind may look as their consciousness becomes awakened. Their answers then determine the immersive experience in the next stage of the experience, dematerialize. Next slide. After the meditation space, viewers then make their way through a threshold from the meditation space into dematerialize, which explores the transitioning state into wakefulness. Next slide. Viewers then enter dematerialize and find their mind space, which is an immersive projection mapped space responding to their meditation session. Next slide. The mind spaces are designed with overlapping planes to signify the interconnection of the mind, body, and environment. The space also includes crashing sand to form a connection with the outside world and reflective floors to create a feeling of boundlessness. Next slide. Viewers enter the mind spaces where their non-physical experiences during the meditation is transformed into a physical, ethereal journey. The immersive projections in the mind spaces are an artistic representation of visualizations of light during meditation. Everyone who practices meditation experiences varying light visualizations which develops with their practice. So here are 6 examples of the Mindspace projections, and they were developed through practice-based research where I led participatory workshops to understand how the space in their mind may look during meditation. Next slide. So these are some of the examples, if you want to flick through. So this is my immersive exhibition proposal. I had hoped to test it physically, but unfortunately because of the pandemic, we didn't have the access to the facilities that we normally would, but hopefully one day I can make it for real. Next slide. Thank you so much for listening.
Hi, I was wondering if we can get also Monica live. If not, it's fine. Let's see. Well, I can start and then we can figure it out. I'm Marta, and also this project is by Monica, who is somewhere here. This is one of our final projects for this year, and it's called Flatland. Next slide. This project came to be out of a mutual interest in synthetic biology and kind of the ways in which technology is intersecting with nature and kind of how that's going to look in the future. Our initial project was more around physical exploration of different materials and kind of looking towards building a exhibition, but obviously because of COVID-19 we had to kind of move the project onto the digital. So basically what it ended up being is a collaborative venture in which we're looking to work on projects, researching and designing for a possible future when our access to the outdoors is going to be constrained by social distancing laws and other reasons such as loss of biodiversity. So what we built is Flatland. It's a digital meadow that presents a future in which human designed natures will live in symbiosis with natural environments. It is guided by three major beliefs, which is humans as equal rather than superior part of nature, in technological development as an extension of human evolution, and in reigniting biophilic behavior through virtual experiences. We are inviting viewers of Flatland to rethink the ways in which they have interacted with nature up until now, and kind of imagine how that could change by the many reasons that I explained before. So maybe considering if maybe a virtual experience could evoke the same feelings and effects that spending time in the outdoors brings for human beings, or if in the future we're going to have further industrialized nature for the kind of production and consumption aims of society, what would we consider wildlife to be? And would that maybe be living in the internet rather than in the physical space? And maybe then could the creation of virtual natures such as Flatland just be another organic step towards our natural evolution? So because of that, we built a main video, which we'll play in a second. And then we were very adamant in kind of building every single aspect of the project from scratch. So we also designed a custom typeface, a set of 3 different AR filters, and then a website which explains the project a bit more in depth, and an Instagram profile, which is kind of our main point of contact with anyone interested with the project. Yeah, can we play the video? Yeah, so like I said before, that was the video, which is kind of one of the main elements of the project. The one that kind of Monica was in the lead of. She is the 3D queen of this collaboration. And then if you go to the next slide, this is the typeface that we developed. It was kind of inspired by merging the 2 worlds that we were talking about, so kind of more natural strokes of the like copper plate letters that you can see, for example, in the F, and then more digital kind of bitmap typefaces. So if you can go to the next slide. Yeah, this is the typeface in use. It is fully functional. And then next slide. And there's some set of applications, one 3D, one normal. Then next slide. Another part of the project was kind of looking at how we can expand the environment of Flatland to each of like different people's kind of personal environment. So the way of doing that was through AR filters with Instagram. So we can look at how they work by clicking on the video link that there's in the presentation. Oh, no, it says click here to look at video. But, well, to be honest, I don't need to show you. Yeah. It's fine. If not, we can go to the next slide. It's just a moving. Yeah. Another of the elements was kind of building a strong Instagram presence, because this is for us not really a static project, but one that we're kind of continuing to work on together, and we have been doing so since we kind of handed in the project a couple of months ago. So I am guessing the link is not the best way of looking at it, but if anyone is interested in looking at it, they can just see on Instagram flatland.world on Instagram. Yeah, we've been kind of uploading new motion stuff and new type stuff, and then you can use the filters there as well. Can you go to the next slide? And then as well, we've been working on this website that kind of gets all of the elements of the project together. And again, if anyone is interested in looking at it, I guess it's better seen in each person's computer. And then, yeah, next slide. Monica is going to speak a little bit about kind of our future plans and how we're developing the project further from now.
Hello.
We can hear.
So yes, I'm the other half of the Flatland. So like talking about future, we will continue to expand our Instagram presence with more filters to come and more videos and typefaces, hopefully. We will also share more of our general research and what we've learned during like making of this project. Another thing, we're planning to have an event when it's possible. So maybe in September, maybe not, we will see. But for the event, we would like to have a sound, like a set from our sound designer. Unfortunately, you couldn't hear the sound at this presentation, but the sound was made by Tom Wilson-Kellett. So if you look at the videos yourself on Instagram, he made the sound. And we would also like to prepare audio reactive performance for the event as well, but that's for the future. And we are also working on a physical installation piece to show at the event. But as I said, it's all depending on the situation. And that's it, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for your excellent presentations, and thank you to all the students who submitted work for the award. The standard across all the submissions was extremely high, and as you've seen, we had an exceptional collection of projects shortlisted. Now, in previous years, the winner has been offered an opportunity to have their project published and presented in the Electronic Visualization in the Arts London conference. The judges felt that the quality was so good this year that they'd like to offer this to all of today's participants. So all of this year's shortlisted students are invited to join the EVA London 2020 conference online in November, and also to have their project published for free online in Science Open and a hard copy printed proceedings in EVA London in July 2021. So well done everyone for that. And now to the winner, the hard part. So the winner receives £500 prize money, ongoing help, networking, contacts and mentoring, as well as the opportunity to have their research published online and the Scientific Open academic website, and an ISBN hard copy proceedings as part of the following year's EVA London conference to a worldwide audience of digital artists and academics, as well as make a presentation at the British Computer Society headquarters in Moorgate, City of London in July 2021. So it's a really fantastic opportunity. The judges decided that Marta and Monica's project Flatland was the winning project in this year's Peter Cannings Memorial Award. So well done, Monica and Marta. So an absolutely fantastic project, and congratulations on winning the award this year. But congratulations to all the shortlisted awardees. Really fantastic selection of submissions. So we were sort of honoured to have them all there. But well done, Monica and Marta. Okay, so now we've come to the end of the session. Thank you, everyone who attended, for being part with us for the award today. I hope you enjoyed looking at the projects as much as the judges enjoyed going over them all. This year's Peter Cannings Memorial Award event was part of the London College of Communication Graduate Showcase. Feel free to browse through the student work after this event by visiting graduateshowcase.arts.ac.uk. Thank you all for watching, and you may now leave the session. Thank you. Bye-bye.